And our next speaker is Kevin White. And Kevin, you can go ahead and share your screen when you like. And I've listened to and read about Kevin's mountain goat work along coastal Alaska over the years, and that convinced me to bring my binos with me and keep an eye out for mountain goats while I was on an Alaskan cruise quite a few years ago now. And we saw a lot of glaciers and goats on the cruise, and we've all heard how climate change is wreaking havoc on some of those famous glaciers along that coastal cruise route. And today, Kevin is going to present on climate and anthropogenic effects on mountain goat population dynamics in coastal Alaska. And Kevin White is a wildlife research biologist for the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Division of Wildlife Conservation, based in Juneau, Alaska since 2001. And he specializes in mountain goat and moose research, primarily in the coastal Southeast Alaska region. And though he has picked up a few odd jobs in other parts of the state over the years. He received an undergraduate degree from Humboldt State University and a graduate degree from the University of Nevada, Reno. And Kevin, go ahead.
Great, thanks a lot for the introduction, Mike, and everybody for your interest in mountain goat population dynamics. What I'm going to be talking about today is an overview of long-term effort to understand mountain goat population dynamics in coastal Alaska and develop a population model that can be used for addressing management and conservation issues. Seems like my presentation is frozen. Oh, there we go. So yeah, just a quick overview of my presentation for today. First, I'm going to talk just about a little bit of background. Next, I'll talk about some initial efforts to estimate mountain goat survival as it relates to sex, age, and climate effects. And then how we use that as baseline information amongst other data resources to develop a population model, which then enabled us to explore some possible effects of climate change on mountain goat populations. We next appended the model to include a feature that enabled us to simulate harvest. And so I'll be talking about some applications that we've recently engaged in to use this model and provide some examples for some of the things that we've learned. And so there's a number of different factors that have been identified that affect mountain goat population dynamics, including summer and winter weather, direct and indirect effects associated with anthropogenic activity, direct and indirect effects associated with predation risk, and at least in some places in the lower 48, disease has been implicated to have important effects on mountain goat population dynamics. Overall, there's a need to improve our mechanistic understanding of how these factors influence mountain goat population dynamics, particularly across space and the different types of geographies and environments that these animals live in, and also to develop quantitative tools that can be helpful for providing data-based understanding and recommendations for management and conservation. So in 2008, Gray Pendleton and several past and current mountain goat research biologists from Alaska collaborated on an analysis that involved summarizing data that was collected across 9 different study sites over a 31-year period to understand how sex and age and summer and winter climate affect mountain goat survival. This analysis was subsequently updated 6 years later, and we ultimately used the results from this updated analysis in our population model. essentially what we learned was that here I have a figure showing predicted annual survival on the y-axis as it relates to total snowfall at sea level on the x-axis, and different lines for different sex and age classes. And what we learned was that as you have greater total snowfall or more severe winter conditions, mountain goat survival is reduced. And we would expect that based on the effects of snow and burying food, increasing the costs of locomotion, and affecting nutritional reserves that enable animals to survive difficult winter conditions. Snowfall, high snowfall is also at least to some degree correlated with avalanche activity and avalanche risk, which is also turns out to be an important source of mortality in our coastal Alaska mountain goat populations. This next panel shows the summer effects on mountain goat survival again on the y-axis, and mean daily temperature during midsummer, which is our index of summer growing season conditions or thermal stress on the x-axis. And we found that increasing summer temperatures resulted in reduced annual survival. In particular, higher summer temperatures resulted in lower survival the following winter. And so we inferred that the growing season conditions and factors related to thermal stress were reducing the ability of animals to accumulate energetic reserves that were important in enabling them to survive the following winter. And so as a take home, the three key points associated with this analysis was that sex and age influenced survival. I didn't really talk specifically about it, but generally what we found was that females have higher survival than males, and that old animals have lower survival than prime-aged or young animals. High snowfall was negatively related to survival, and cool summers was positively related to survival. We then worked with my colleague, Tal Levy from Oregon State University, and Tal really did the heavy lifting in developing a matrix population model in program R that incorporated sex and age structure and incorporated these models that can enable us to simulate the effects of summer and winter conditions. We ultimately added a harvest component, and I just wanted to mention that this model incorporates stochasticity associated with predicted summer and winter effects, as well as model uncertainty. This model here is, I've provided a schematic. So we start out with the initial population size, of course. We then incorporate information that we have about survival. So including these survival models that are modeling the effect of summer and winter temperature on mountain goat survival for each different sex and age class, not including kids. So for example, we would, if we're interested in modeling survival for a particular site, we would determine what the summer temperature was and the winter snowfall was. We would plug that into the model. It would then return the associated survival estimates for animals in each sex and age class. There would be uncertainty associated with our model, as well as the uncertainty associated with variability in climate for a particular area based on historic information. We then incorporate information about reproduction, which involves age-specific reproduction estimates or fecundity estimates based on data that's been collected in coastal Alaska. And then to address the issue of density dependence, we use data that was previously published by Houston et al. Based on data that was collected in the Olympic Peninsula. And then that results with the population size at T-1. This is just a life cycle schematic showing the sex and age structure of the population model. And then I just kind of want to briefly mention that for non-kid survival, as I talked about, we use the models that we developed from our paper in 2011. In regards to kids survival, since kids survival data is very limited, and we don't have kids survival data for Alaska, we used estimates that were provided in Rice and Gay, which is really kind of a global estimate that was derived from multiple studies and just using the average across multiple studies. As I mentioned, we use age-specific fecundity data that have collected in southeastern Alaska, and then the density-dependent function from Houston et al. In 1994. And so the next question this led to is our interest in trying to learn about the effects of climate change on mountain goat populations. And the reason why this was of interest is global circulation models predict that snowfall in southeastern Alaska is going to be declining over time, but that summer temperature is going to be increasing over time. And so as you might remember, declining snowfall is good for mountain goats in that it would result in reduced mortality. However, increasing summer would be bad. And so basically our question was, which of these two effects is likely to be more important for mountain goats? Is summer temperature exerting a more important effect over these range of values for predicted increase in summer temperature, or as it relates to winter snowfall? And so we ran simulations using predicted estimates of how climate will change in southeastern Alaska over a 70-year time period for 5 different global circulation models at 2 different emission scenarios. And overall, what we found was that in 5 out of the 10 scenarios, that the models were predicting that mountain goat populations would decline, that small populations were more vulnerable than larger populations, as you might expect, due to small population size, sensitivity to environmental stochasticity. And so ultimately, we determined that the negative effects of increasing summer temperature over these sort of predicted range of values associated with climate change models were more important than the positive effects of reduced winter snowfall. And so the next thing that we're interested in doing was incorporating the tool for addressing incorporating harvest into this population model. And so next I'm going to sort of talk about how we did that briefly. And so modeling harvest, it turns out, as many of you probably know, is maybe not quite as straightforward as you might expect. The approach that we used involved taking a random selection of non-kids and yearlings, so assuming kids and yearlings were not being harvested, based on the stable age distribution of a population. So we would estimate based on input vital rate information, the number of males and females in each age class that were available in a population for being harvested. And then we would randomly select animals based on some criteria here that I'll talk about below. So we had 2 different options for simulating harvest, and one is just user defined. So you could simply say, we want to run a simulation and we want to harvest like 1 male and 1 female, or 7 males and 0 females. And so it's user defined. The second option, which is one that we felt was sort of more real, would enable us to more realistically simulate harvest, is what we termed constant harvest. And so this incorporates hunter selectivity and accounts for the proportion of males in the population. And so, as many of you know, mountain goats are notoriously hard to determine their sex in the field. And so most jurisdictions, harvest of male and female mountain goats is allowed. And so what we found in Alaska is about 72% statewide of the harvest is males and 28% is females. But you can imagine the scenario where if you have really heavy harvest of males, you start depleting the number of males in the population, the proportion of males in the population declines, and the probability of you harvesting a male is going to be likewise declining. And so we developed this function that takes that into consideration. So as the proportion of males in the population, as you can see in this panel on the x-axis declines, the proportion of males in the population declines, the proportion of males in the harvest likewise declines. And this function is sort of tuned based on the data for hunter selectivity for Alaska, but it could be modified for any different scenario. It's somewhat less conservative than other scenarios that people have used that have assumed that harvest would be 50% males, 50% females. So just for example, this is just sort of some example output from preliminary analysis showing population growth rate on the y-axis, population size on the x-axis, and just providing some example of how this kind of simulation tool can be used. And so this is sort of addressing a question: if you just want to harvest one mountain goat, what's the minimum population size that you need to have? And so based on this analysis, we would, might suggest that you need to have a population size of about 70 animals if you don't want to have a probability of a population declining to be greater than 25%. So I just want to talk about how we've used this, this model in a recent application that involves this mountain goat population on the Cleveland Peninsula in southeastern Alaska near Ketchikan. And so the Cleveland Peninsula is an interesting geography in that on the north, there's glacial fjord, and on the south, there's another glacial fjord. And so the area is somewhat geographically isolated at a large scale, but at a broader scale, there's several different sort of subpopulations that are separated by geographic barriers. And it was unclear the extent that which these populations were actually genetically differentiated or demographically distinct. And so in collaboration with Aaron Schaefer and his lab, we did extensive field sampling and determined that there was 4 different genetically distinct populations. And so at the upper Cleveland Peninsula, there is a population, subpopulation, middle Cleveland Peninsula, and then on the lower Cleveland Peninsula, there's sort of 2 subpopulations. And what Aaron determined is the further down the peninsula you go, the less genetic diversity there is, supporting the concept of there being kind of a stepping stone model of genetic diversity in this population. And so there's kind of a question that we're interested in addressing is, well, what if you were just managing the whole population as just one panmictic population without having knowledge of genetic data and assuming that this population was sort of free ranging or freely moving amongst this whole entire area? And then how does your perspective change about how you should be managing this population if you incorporate genetic information? And so what we see is that these different genetic subpopulations have different population sizes, and some are very small, like the lower Cleveland Peninsula. These 2 different subpopulations have, were estimated to be 23 or 13 animals. The middle Cleveland Peninsula is 74, and the upper Cleveland Peninsula is 84. And so we wanted to use genetic information to provide rationale for defining the demographically distinct subpopulations, and then run population modeling simulations to determine what appropriate sustainable harvest would be under these, for each of these different populations, and then contrast that with kind of the null model, which is assuming that the population is panmictic and a much larger freely flowing population. This is just a quick picture showing the type of isolation that's occurring between the middle Cleveland Peninsula and the lower Cleveland Peninsula. There's a large barrier of low elevation conifer forest that's not a suitable mountain goat habitat. So it's fairly distinct geographic difference or geographic barrier between these 2 populations. And so these are the results of our analyses. We ran 2 different scenarios. One was like kind of the most worst case scenarios, looking at if you harvested 1 female. And then the second is using the constant harvest simulation of harvesting 1 mountain goat, which basically there's a 1 in 3 chance that would be a female. And then evaluating lambda for each of these different subpopulation scenarios, and then the predicted number of animals that could be sustainably harvested over a 50-year, or running the model out for 50 years, and determining whether lambda would be would not be greater than or less than 1. And so basically what we determine is that it's not possible to have sustainable harvest for these smaller populations by virtue of their small population size. And then for the middle and upper Cleveland Peninsula, it could be possible to have sustainable harvest, but not if it was involving a female every single year. And by contrast, the null model, the model that includes the entire Cleveland Peninsula as one panmictic model, would suggest that you could have sustainable harvest, which sort of highlights here again. Actually, I'll show, here's the figures of these population simulations. And so with each different population scenario on the y-axis, also showing population size, and then across the 50-year time runs. So what I guess the key findings was that genetic analysis was key for appropriately delineating populations, and the smallest, most isolated populations were unable to sustain harvest, inappropriately assuming that the entire peninsula as a single large panmictic population could lead to overharvest of small populations. So for example, if you set your harvest quota assuming that the entire peninsula was one population, you might actually end up harvesting animals from parts of the lower Cleveland Peninsula that have a small population size that can't actually sustain harvest, and you might have negative impacts on those populations relative to their persistence. So it's very important, linking back to the value of having genetic analysis to define what the appropriate population delineation is. And female harvest had more pronounced effects on population harvest than the constant harvest scenario. So overall, the take-home messages is that population modeling can provide key insight about the relative strength of winter versus summer effects and harvest. That mountain goat populations have a high sensitivity to harvest, especially small populations. Genetic analyses can play a key role in delineating populations, and extensive long-term data collection is key for developing mechanistic population models and projecting effects. Some of the considerations, constraints, and inference associated with our work involve, bringing, kind of emphasizing that this is a powerful approach for understanding population processes and assessing conservation and management scenarios. It's really a valuable tool for in management context. Yet it's important to keep in mind that it's data intensive, and that there's a high requirement to have extensive data over a long period of time for many areas to have realistic population models, and that we have a need to have better information in regards to some of the input parameters for our model, and that it's always important, to have a better mechanistic understanding of a system. So with that, I would like to acknowledge many people who are involved with this work, and if there is time for questions, I'd be happy to address them, or I can just follow up using the electronic tool.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Yeah, we are definitely over on time, so there are some questions there. So yeah, please go ahead and answer those when you get a chance. And